Today is another episode of going into our fantasy world Warcraft style diorama. Last time I had these lanterns which were still placeholder. The gate was missing texture and the golden trims all around were kind of shiny and they were more PBR realistic than they were actually stylized. The trims on the edges of the cobbled path were just a texture on a relatively very flat geometry. The grass textures were not refined, and on top I didn't really yet have any of this cool, really lush and fluffy grass that you can see. In this video I'll take you through a quick journey of how I made all of the above parts that we mentioned, plus some extra. If you're a student of the arts, or you're a gamer, or you're just someone who wants to see some time lapses and some devlog process of the making of a field that you're maybe decently related to, then stay a while and listen. I'm very happy to have you here today. I started painting the tiling grass texture right after I finished the cobble path that we saw in the previous video. I'm going to be creating a bunch of grass assets. We'll take a look at those in the next chapter, but for everything to look fine and for the environment to feel like it's very lush and very populated with nice flora, we need a texture to first go on the landscape. You can see most of the process of creating this grass texture on the time lapse on the screen right now. I started with some noise I created in Substance Designer. I absolutely love that software. The idea behind that was to give myself some moss-like structures and start painting on top of that, instead of starting with a blank canvas. Blank canvas is kind of scary. With that moss, I tried a few colors, shaping up gradients on the texture at first. Once I liked the hues, I moved the image into Photoshop and I started painting by hand on top. I experiment with a few different shapes at first, but I slowly settle on one specific leaf-like shape that you can see on the screen. I then copy that and I scatter it around. I have a pattern preview feature of Photoshop on, so I can see if I'm making repetition too obvious or if I'm actually leaving any gaps here and there that might look kind of bad. If any of those things happen, I will kind of correct them quickly. From there on, it's mostly rendering. The final result is seen on the screen. Most likely I will go in and render even a bit more further by the end of this entire project, but for now it's enough, and we move on to the foliage assets next. So far I painted all of my tiling textures using only Photoshop. I do that on my Wacom stylus. I've had that tablet for 12 years now. I prefer the big 4K screen on my desktop computer, and having painted with that Wacom tablet for so long, so many years, I just really like it. I'm very used to it. For the Foliage Atlas, however, I had something else in mind. I decided to paint it on my iPad using Procreate and my Apple Pen. Before I get into that, let me quickly give you an overview of what actually Foliage Atlas is, so you get a better idea of what we're doing. The concept is rather simple. You paint your flora in a way that is flat on 2D and looks almost like you took a real-life leaf or a flower and you pressed it between the pages of an old book. The foliage flattens down, but you can see lots of detail, and depending on how fresh the pressing is, sometimes the colors and textures are still the same as when the piece of foliage was alive, just as you picked the flower. With foliage atlases, you're creating your own botanical specimens, but instead of them being between the pages of a book, they're on a 2D texture. After you've painted your plant pieces, your grassy blades, your petals, leaves, and so on, you derive an opacity mask. In the game engine, you combine the opacity texture and the base color painting and you place them on a 2D plane. The final result is a cutout of your botanical specimen that can be manipulated in 3D space in order to build up the appearance of a 3-dimensional plant prop. I painted the majority of my atlas in Procreate, but as a final few steps I exported all of them to a .psd file format and I opened it up on the big screen on my PC. From there I did some final tweaks to the values and colors, and then I started using it all in Blender and later in Unreal Engine in order to derive the final foliage assets that you can see on the screen right now. Painting foliage atlases for stylized art is just incredibly fun and it's so relaxing. Well, for the most part, I did have a tiny bit of a freak out at one moment, thinking that I will not manage, but it can be very fun and relaxing. Give it a go. I hope to do more of it myself soon too. I've not made foliage in a while, and as such with my intro to it I wanted to start with something a little less challenging. Something that would let me stretch and warm up for any more difficult 3D foliage assets. I started with the bush because their simplified shapes would allow me to drive right into without overthinking. I look at the bushes as large spheres that are squished a bit on one side. On their surface, they need a tiny bit of textures. That's everything. I'm not going to overcomplicate it by trying to build see-through silhouette. I just need a bit of interest on the edges of my 2D cards, and then the shapes will build up from there, from just a sphere. I already have the spheres blocked out in my Unreal scene. I take their relative measurement and I open it up in Blender. In there, I load up my Foliage Atlas, the one that I made in the previous chapter. After cutting up the bushy shape textures I've painted, I give it a few subdivisions. These allow me to stretch the edges of the bush while keeping the middle vertices where they are. As a result, we get a plane that is a bit folded, as if you've pressed on the sides of a piece of paper. The central piece of the paper is a bit inflated outwards as a result of the pressure that you're applying. This means that if I create enough copies of that plane and I rotate them enough times, I'll create a shape that is similar to a sphere. Imperfect one, but perfect for our use case here. Once I'm confident with the primitives I've built, I add modifiers to them. I go for Edit Normal. In Source Shape, I select a new sphere that I drag far under the world, under my bush shape. That changes all of my normals. It recalculates them, that's all the smoothing groups and normals on the surface of the mesh. As a result, the dark gradients in the smoothing will go away and all of the shape will turn brighter. Once inspected with no texture on top, of course, because if you turn on the texturing, you cannot actually see the normals that well, but be sure they actually change the appearance. I import all of the above into Unreal 5 and I make sure to tick off Recalculate Normals in the import settings. If I don't, the Edit Normal that I did in Blender as a final step will be now removed and I will really be back to square one. I really want my Edit Normals modifier to be in because the brighter smoothing means that wherever one part of my 2D card meets another one, because like these bushes are just collections of lots of these cards, it will blend better. There will not be like a really harsh line. This is a trick that all foliage in video games uses, by the way. It's not something that I'm using this one-off. With the bush in engine, I test it out a few times. I then tweak my colors and my values inside of my material in Unreal. A few times I go back to my Photoshop texturing and directly in there I tweak the contrast and the detail a bit further. I go through a few variants of the bush and by the end I'm happy with the version currently on the screen. I plan to revisit it later, as I usually do and say at the end of every chapter related to this project, but for now I like it. Our time is limited and sadly we've run out today. Stay tuned in order to see more in the next episodes. I think we are nearly approaching the finishing line of this project, and in the next few videos we will go over things like texturing the gateway itself, those streams at the sides of the path that I promised to talk about, and plenty more. I also didn't really cover all of the foliage that I want to talk about, so again, subscribe, keep in touch, and you'll see it in the next videos. I want to thank you again for being here with me today, and I hope that you feel inspired and you learned something valuable from today's video. Make sure to like and subscribe, leave a comment with any question that you have down in the section, press the bell button in order to get notified for anything new. If that worked out, because I cannot see. And is the audio okay? I think it's rather fine. Cool.